This is Richard Nixon, the nation's 37th president, who, in 1974, became the first and only president to ever resign from office. But how did it come to this? What could have possibly caused Nixon to give up America's most important and powerful position? This is the story of Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal, and the Supreme Court case that led to his resignation from the executive office. Let's set the scene. Our story begins in 1972. Nixon, a Republican, is president of the United States. But there was so much more going on around this time. I mean, it was the 70s. The Godfather had just hit the theaters, Queen was still rising in the music scene, but at the same time, the death penalty had just been ruled unconstitutional. An assassination attempt was made on Governor George C. Wallace, the US was ending its participation in Vietnam, and Nixon made a very surprising and noteworthy visit to communist China. There were so many stories, but these are not the stories we're talking about today. June 17th, 1972, the Watergate Hotel. Frank Wills, a night guard at the hotel, patrols the halls in the early morning hours of the day. Everything seems as usual. That is, until he notices the door. More specifically, the lock. A piece of tape is placed in such a way that it effectively disables the lock. Wills quickly removes the tape and notes the anomaly in his security lock, then resumes his rounds. 30 minutes later, Wills returns to the site where the tape had previously been, only to find it's mysteriously returned. There was an intruder in the building. Wills immediately contacts police, who arrive shortly afterwards to search the building, and what they found would soon become one of the most famous scandals in US history. 5 men, all hiding in the Democratic National Committee headquarters office. They had been caught red-handed, attempting to microphone bug the office. The 5 men were arrested and pled guilty to their charges, but there was one specific detail that changed the whole significance of the case. All 5 men were associated with the Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP. This organization was none other than Nixon's very own re-election campaign. All eyes were pointed toward Nixon as the one behind the scheme. An investigation was quickly launched regarding the break-in, and soon Nixon was ordered to hand over a selection of tapes to be used as evidence. However, these weren't any old unimportant tapes. These tapes contained conversations between Nixon and his associates recorded inside the Oval Office. But only Nixon himself knew what these tapes truly contained. The tapes had all the evidence the courts needed to tie him to the scandal. If they were to be released, Nixon would surely be impeached and thrown out of office, and go down in American history as a liar, a cheat, and a fraud. With no other move, Nixon sued the United States. The case went right to the Supreme Court due to its high profile. After all, in 1974, Richard Nixon was still the president. Nixon's claim was simple. He argued that his executive privilege, or the president's right to safeguard certain information, meant that he did not have to hand over the requested tapes. The stakes were as high as ever for Nixon. If he lost this case, his whole life would be turned upside down. He would be exposed as a criminal to the public eye, and would only be remembered for his sinister actions as president. On July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court had reached a decision. It was a unanimous decision. Every single justice agreed. The court ruled that the Constitution, whilst outlining separation of powers, did not specify that the president has complete privilege to withhold documents. Since the US follows due process, Nixon was required to hand over the tapes. Chief Justice Warren Burger reasoned, "Neither the doctrine of separation of powers nor the need for confidentiality of high-level communications without more can sustain an absolute unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances." The court believed that while a level of separation and confidentiality is important in the government, Nixon was not immune from due process and had to comply with the courts. The truth would be revealed. The court received the tapes. Richard Nixon had been exposed. The public now viewed him only for his crime, and he was facing certain impeachment. The country was outraged. Richard Nixon didn't have many options left. On August 9th, 1974, less than a month after he lost his case, Richard Nixon resigned from the executive office, hoping to keep the last shred of dignity he had remaining. In the midst of the chaos, Nixon's vice president, Gerald Ford, took the lead. As the rest of the country was fuming with rage against Nixon, Ford saw all the anger and hatred the scandal had caused, and he took action. On September 8th, 1974, now President Gerald Ford famously pardoned Richard Nixon from his criminal charges. In Ford's speech addressing the nation, he famously states, I do believe
with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy.
Richard Nixon was now free from his charges, but this did cause another small wave of controversy among the American people. However, Ford kept the country moving forward and proved to be an effective president. By the end of his 3-year term, he had cut inflation by more than half and helped bring the country out of a recession. The country had moved on, and the question of presidential immunity in the judicial system had finally been answered. Or had it? Today in the Supreme Court, a near identical case stands before the justices. This is the case of none other than Donald J. Trump. For those who don't know already, President Trump is facing 91 charges altogether for various actions throughout his presidency. However, Trump is now claiming that he is immune to being prosecuted for actions he took as president. This claim of some type of immunity from due process as a president is almost identical to that made by Richard Nixon almost 50 years ago. An entirely new lineup of justices takes on the same question in a completely different context. But, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court still ties back to its one root principle: justice. And justice will be served. America.